Thank you, everyone, for joining us here today for our CCAP workshop on retooling community energy planning. Basically, our aim here is to introduce you to some of the sort of data decision support tools that are sort of available through the CCAP network. This, of course, isn't an exhaustive list, but just some of the tools that are available from University of Guelph, from our friends at Quest, or our friends at Quest are working on, and SFU. So just before we kind of get started, a couple introductory slides. Thanks to the hosts, my employer, the Toronto Region Conservation Authority, who has given us access to this room. And of course, the Ontario Climate Consortium, who I work with. We have the chair, Peter Love, here in the room. So the OCC is a collaborative of academic institutions. We have the University of Guelph, and Kirby Calvert is here representing Guelph. We have Mark Linfield from York University. We have Western U. Unfortunately, Jamie Baxter was unable to make it today. And we have McMaster. So we're a collaborative trying to connect academic research to planning policy and implementation on climate action. So a bit of a CCAP recap. We're sort of set up as really a platform to sort of mobilize knowledge. Like two ways really, from the practitioner community in local government to academic researchers, to inform them as to what kind of research questions are sort of the burning ones that are most needed to help move planning and implementation forward, and vice versa. So that's kind of what we're here for today, really. So I won't take up too much time there, but just a reminder, really, CCAP is operating under what we're calling our Knowledge to Action agenda, which was developed over the course of 2016. Many of you here were at our workshop in November at the TRCA headquarters, where this really kind of culminated. And today we're really focusing on the data and decision support tools research theme. So in terms of our agenda today, as you know, we're starting a little bit late, but we've got three presentations. Morgan from SFU will be presenting some work that the Energy and Materials Research Group at SFU did with the City of Vancouver, and I think you're working on with Victoria now on that as well. And I think there's another grad student who's looking at doing the same model in Guelph as well. So there's trying to bring that tool here. Michael Lee from Quest will be presenting a cost-benefit analysis tool that was really developed a few years ago in 2011 as part of the Integrated Energy Mapping for Ontario Communities project under the Canadian Urban Institute. They're looking at kind of whether and how it could be updated to be more applicable to a broader range of Ontario and perhaps Canada-wide municipalities, maybe not yet, but Ontario-wide at least. And then finally, Kirby, the final presentation, Kirby will be talking about some of his work to look at mapping renewable energy at the landscape scale, and the role that could play in support planning and implementation. There's quite a bit of echo. Sorry about that. We'll have a bit of discussion afterwards, and then a discussion on the three tools. I'm going to say we're going to reserve question. We'll have any kind of clarifying questions on the presentations after each one, but we're going to reserve any kind of detailed discussion or sort of probing questions until the end of all three. We'll have lunch. Lunch will be served here. If you're sun-starved, I know it's a beautiful day, there is the Pioneer Village just out there. Maybe you could take a step outside for a quick walk. I would support that. And then afterwards, we're going to roll up our sleeves for really an interactive energy mapping exercise on these tables, so kind of moving away from the presentation kind of mode into more of an interactive discussion. All right. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Morgan.
Okay, So hi everybody, my name is Morgan. I'm from SFU, as Kirby mentioned. So I'll introduce myself a little bit more in a minute. But first I wanted to start off talking about the pre-workshop survey that we made everyone fill out. So thank you to those of you who did that. And just to give you an idea of who's in the room, so everyone here knows who they are and what their experience is with analytical tools and community energy, but just so that you know what to expect when we launch into the discussion and everything. So, who filled out the survey? Mostly people from municipal and local governments, though there were quite a few people from civil societies, academia, or the private sector as well. And most respondents said that they had either basic or moderate level of analytical tools or modeling. So certainly if this is all new to you, don't feel like you're alone. There were a few people who said they're quite knowledgeable and experienced as well. So we have a mix. And lastly, people said that they were the most familiar with spatial tools. So the people have most experience with that. How do people use analytical tools? So we asked a few questions about this. So spatial tools are most often used in-house. That would be like ArcGIS. A lot of people said they're familiar with that and have people working who have that knowledge set. Engineering models like RetScreen, most likely to be contracted out or mixed between used in-house and contracted out. And then the other models, so cost models, simulation models, most likely to be contracted out. So those are the types of models where people don't necessarily have the skills in-house, but they are using that information. And last but not least, we asked people about what they were interested in, what their priorities were. And there is a huge range of responses. So everything from data sources in quality to best practices for data analysis. And then some specific projects were mentioned, often having to do with local energy systems or cost analysis. So as Ian mentioned, we're going to be presenting 3 different approaches or tools today. So hopefully you'll find something within at least one, but hopefully all 3 of those presentations that's helpful for you. And if there's anything that you want to know more about that didn't come up during the presentations, then feel free to raise that during the discussion. Okay, so with that, I'm going to launch into my longer presentation. Just one sec. Yeah. Okay, so I also have the first presentation of the day on a specific tool. So the topic of this presentation is going to be municipal policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, something that I think is very familiar to most people in the room, and how do we know whether or not they have an effect. So I'll just introduce myself a bit more here. So Simon Fraser University is one of the academic institutions partnering on CCAP. Mark Jackert is the professor at SFU who's the lead for this, and I'm a student of his, and we both work in the Energy and Materials Research Group. So eMERGE, the Energy and Materials Research Group, has been doing policy evaluation for a long, long time. So that's what we're kind of bringing to the table here at CCAP, and we have a number of partners in Vancouver. So we're going to be doing a meeting like this in Vancouver as well, where we're going to be tying those folks in. So that's how we're fitting into this larger CCAP picture. And again, my name is Morgan, and the type of research and work I'm doing is going to be very, very similar to what I'm presenting on today. So just a really quick agenda so you have an idea of what to expect. Since I'm the first one going up today, I'm going to do a quick overview of analytical tools in the planning process, very, very brief. And then I'm going to talk about a specific tool. It's called SIMS. It's an energy economy model. And then I'll talk about how we've applied that to a municipal case study, Vancouver, and then end up with a few conclusions to get you thinking about some things you might want to ask during the discussion. All right, so I'll get right into the nuts and bolts, tools in the planning process. So of course, analytical tools and the planning process are 2 really broad categories that can mean a lot of things. So I'm not going to try and do an exhaustive definition of those, but just to give you an idea of where this tool is going to fit into that. So one way I could think about articulating the planning process is starting off with an objective, so figuring out what your goals or what your targets are. And then the next step would be figuring out the policy pathway to achieve those objectives. So what actions are you going to take to try and reach that goal? And then from there, you would expect to observe an outcome, which then you can then map back to your objective to see how you're doing. So I'm going to bring in an example. So a very commonly articulated objective in this field would be reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So something like reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 80%, say by 2050, relative to 2005 levels. And if you're working for local government, a policy you might consider to try and get there could be something like restricting parking for gasoline cars. And the outcome you would hope to observe from that would be something like reduced emissions from gasoline car use. So tools could be used at basically any part of this process, and some of the other presentations today are going to be showing you different ways that they can be used. But what I'm going to focus on today is the use of tools for policy evaluation. So tools that would fit in here in the process after you're thinking about a policy and you want to know how that's going to map out in terms of meeting your objectives. So for instance, here, if you were considering that policy for restricting parking for gasoline cars, you might use an analytical tool to evaluate that policy to see what outcome you might expect and how that compares to the objective. So the tool might tell you, all right, we think that you might get a 5% reduction in emissions from this policy. And then you can loop back around to the objective, and you can see it's getting you 5% of the way, but you still have 75% more to go. So this kind of tool is really useful in this context where municipalities and other levels of government have done a great job, fantastic job at making objectives, tons of great goals out there, but it's been really hard to follow up on those goals with an effective policy pathway. So I think that's been the challenging part. And so this kind of tool can be sort of a truth testing for governments who are really honest about wanting to achieve these ambitious targets to see if what they're proposing are really going to get them there. So the tool I'm talking about today is called SIMS, and it fits into that category of analytical tools for policy evaluation. So SIMS is a tool that we use at the Energy and Materials Research Group and have used it for policy evaluation at the provincial and federal level for many, many years. And in the last 5 to 10 years, we've been jumping in more to using it at the municipal level. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about SIMS, so bear with me because this is the nuts and bolts, but the idea here is to give you an idea of how SIMS works so that you can understand how you might use an energy and economy tool like this to answer questions that you might have. So essentially, in a nutshell, SIMS is an energy economy simulation model. So what that means is it's just predicting the likely effect of a policy or policies over a 30 to 50 year time span. So it's looking into the future and trying to see what we think will happen if we implement certain policies. So as an energy economy tool, it's looking at the flow of energy and energy systems through our economy. So that's the kind of indicators you can expect if you're using this sort of tool. So some examples of key output that you would get. Greenhouse gas emissions, obviously, is the big one, but we also look at fuel use and market shares of technologies, which I'm going to get into in a bit more detail in just a minute. So how does SIMS do this? Essentially, by simulating how people are making decisions about energy-using technologies. So there are two pieces there, the technologies piece and the people piece. So I'm going to go into those in some more detail so that you can see how the model works. So by technologies, we really just mean anything that uses energy, anything from refrigerators, light bulbs, cars. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of technologies in the model, and they're all competing for people to use them. So essentially in the model, we're starting with all these technologies, and then we're looking at the type of fuel that they use and the emissions that come from that and building our way up. And the way that the model does this is through competing technology market shares. So spared you all the pain of looking at a long algorithm. So I'm just trying to simplify things here. So we use what we call the market share algorithm, where we look at those market shares that I had mentioned to figure out how much of the market a particular technology will capture by comparing the costs of that technology to the costs of all the competing technologies. So for example, something that's often really interesting to people is what would the market share of electric vehicles be if we implement certain policies, say like a low carbon fuel standard. So what you would do is compare the cost of electric vehicles to biofuel vehicles, gasoline vehicles, diesel vehicles, and so on to get an idea of how many people you think are going to purchase those electric vehicles, how much they're going to be driven. So there is a bit of an issue with that, though, that we found, which is that not everyone picks the cheapest option. So if we just looked at cost, the cheapest option would always win. Everyone would drive the bus. No one would have a job. It would be great. But we know that that's not the case. So that brings in the second piece, which is the human behavior piece. So I'm going to go through 3 examples to illustrate how we build that into the model. So the first example, if electric vehicles were cheaper than gasoline cars, would everyone buy electric vehicles? So say by like a token amount, like $100. Would everyone just buy an electric vehicle? Probably not. I think most people would say no. And there are a lot of reasons for that. One could be the perceived risk of trying out a new technology. If my electric vehicle breaks in like the Muskokas, is someone going to be able to fix it? Are there parts available? The convenience is a big factor as well. It takes 5 minutes to drive and fuel up my car at the gas station, but it can take 2, 4, 8 hours to charge up an electric vehicle. So all of these different factors that are not costs, but that are affecting people's decisions on whether or not to use a certain technology, we refer to as intangible costs. Sorry, one sec. Thanks. Can you just click that again? Oh, yeah. So we call those intangible costs. So remember that one for later because it's going to come up. So basically by intangible costs, we just mean anything that doesn't have a financial cost that's affecting someone's decision. So that can have to do with convenience, the quality of a service that's being provided, the risk of trying out a new technology, and so on. So the second example, why don't people purchase energy-efficient appliances with higher upfront costs but lower life cycle costs? So we'll often hear things like, energy-efficient refrigerators or rangers or dryers being cost competitive with their standard counterparts, but not everyone goes out and purchases that. And oftentimes these are technologies with higher upfront costs but lower operating costs. And so something we run into is people putting more weight on a cost or a benefit in the present than in the future. So anyone with an economics background probably sees where I'm going with this. Talking about the discount rate, which is just our way of trying to capture the fact that people value benefits and costs in the present more than in the future, which is pretty typical of many economic analyses, but we do tend to use very high discount rates to try and get at that aspect of behavior. So 20% plus, depending on what technology we're looking at. And the third example, why doesn't everyone who drives a four-door sedan decide to buy a Honda Civic? So why would anyone ever purchase like a Toyota Corolla over a Honda Civic? Or why would anyone buy a Hummer over a Honda Civic? So this one's pretty intuitive. We're just getting at the fact that everyone is different. Everyone has different motivations and different preferences. So all else being equal, we know there's always going to be a variety in what people are choosing to do with the technologies that they're purchasing. So we just call that market heterogeneity. So 3 factors: intangible costs, discount rate, market heterogeneity. So returning back to that market share algorithm where I'd been talking about costs. So we can break that down a bit further. So we have the discount rate feeding into the financial costs. As I mentioned, pretty typical. But then we also include intangible costs, and market heterogeneity is non-financial costs. And over the years, a lot of work has been done in Emerge estimating those values, doing some surveys, discrete choice models, reviewing the literature, and so on to get values and information for those so that we can put those into the model. Okay, so that was the nuts and bolts part. So hopefully everyone now knows how to use Sims. So what I'm going to do now is run through a case study. So as I mentioned,
So what, for intangible costs and market heterogeneity, what do? You're adding an adder to each technology?
Yeah.
Effectively within the system?
Yep, that's basically it. So every technology has an intangible cost associated with it. So for whatever the standard is, it could be $0. But then for something like walking or cycling, we add in a cost so that the model is producing results that show us how many people actually walk and cycle.
For each technology you figured out an intangible
Yes.
cost. Presumably
That's right.
transparent somewhere in terms of
Oh, yeah.
how you got to that.
Yes. Yeah. Good question. Oh, yeah.
You mentioned discount rate, and you're referring to it more from a behavioral perspective rather than,
Yes.
I think, the way that an economist would look at it is the time value of money.
Yeah, yeah.
Would that also incorporate people's perceptions of, for example, where unit costs are going for electric petroleum versus electricity in the future?
Yeah, I suppose you could include it in that. Well, I guess in the model, we have some feedbacks that are including cost estimates for energy into the future. And depending on the scale of the model, will include like petroleum refining and crude as sectors in the model. So it can be reflected in the discount rate depending on the technology, but it's also included in the model in other ways as well. Yeah. Okay, yeah, one more.
Yeah, so I had thought early on that this incorporated sort of an S-curve, an adaptation S-curve, that no matter how good the technology is and how superior, there's always just going to be, a lag of 5 or 10 years just to get it available and out and information on it. And that's how I understood your model 10 or 15 years ago. Is that still there, or is it?
Yes, yeah. So I didn't touch on that, but we call that the declining capital cost function. So again, for every technology in the model, we have a function that is helping us estimate how the cost of that technology might lower, and that's dynamic and it responds to certain policies. So if we have a policy encouraging uptake of like electric vehicles, then we might expect the cost of those to decline more rapidly than in the absence of policy. Okay, I'm going to move on to the case study, but if you do have any burning questions, feel free to shoot up your hand or just ask at the end. Okay, so the case study that we've looked at recently is Vancouver. So in 2015, Vancouver released their renewable city strategy with the goal of using 100% renewable energy in the city by 2050, which I believe Oxford County around here has essentially the same objective. And they also want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2050 relative to 2005 levels. Main sources of emission, as I would say, just about every community in Canada, are gasoline in cars and natural gas in buildings. So they're really targeting the transportation sector and the building sector. So the key questions that we looked at in this study, and to give you an idea of the kind of questions you might ask with this type of tool: what types of policies are needed for Vancouver to achieve that 100% renewable target? Is the city's current policy pathway sufficient? And we also looked at how the city is affected by policy made at the provincial or federal government level. So I'm going to quickly talk about the key policies that we looked at the municipal level. We included Vancouver's 2040 Transportation Plan, which touches on planned upgrades for transit infrastructure and cycling, walking infrastructure. We also included some planned changes to land use in that as well. We talked about vehicle parking restrictions, and for buildings, we looked at building code requirements for both new buildings and retrofits. And here I will mention that Vancouver does have its own building code because it's a charter city, so they don't have to go with the provincial building code, which is pretty significant and somewhat unique for Vancouver. And then one of the things the model can do is, in tandem, by looking at these municipal policies, they can also look at higher level policies and how they interact. So we included the BC carbon tax, soon to become the national price on carbon, the BC low carbon fuel standard, and some federal fuel emission requirements, as well as some others that are thrown in there. So one of the challenges with SIMS that we've run into when we're trying to apply it at the municipal level is that a lot of these policies that we're talking about for municipalities are really spatial in nature. So in an energy economy model, it's simple enough to model a standard, a regulation, or an economic policy, but it's a lot harder to model what we think, adding on a transit station is going to do in terms of getting people to take the bus or something like that. So to address this, we've been working with what we call SIMS Spatial. So this is just sort of an extension to SIMS that has a spatial component that's allowing us to capture some of those municipal policies. So essentially, the spatial model works by starting off with a representation of those planned changes. So just basically a map of improvements to infrastructure, changes to land use, and so on. And then we've worked on understanding how those changes relate to those intangible costs that I mentioned. So convenience, quality of service, how are those affected by these types of policies? So we've developed another algorithm or function to try and reflect that. So what we do is we take the representation, we apply that function, and then we come up with some information on how those changes would affect intangible costs. So we're really targeting those intangible costs to incorporate those municipal policies into the model. So from there, once we've done all of our mapping and we have those intangible costs, we put those into SIMS. So as I had mentioned in response to a question, we have a number for each technology, so we incorporate those as a way of reflecting those policies. So to make that a bit more tangible, just a couple examples. So something like this map on the right is showing cycling and walking in Vancouver in 2050. So these are all the networks that we expect to have for bike lanes, walk destinations, land use. So we start with the plan, we make it into a map, And then that map on the left-hand side turns into the map on the right-hand side. So it's sort of like a heat map showing the intangible costs for different parts of the city, with the blue and green areas being lower intangible costs. So it's more convenient, better quality of service, less risky to be walking or cycling or taking public transit. And then the red and orange areas, higher intangible costs, essentially. So just to give you an example of what that actually looks like, those intangible cost maps, this is one for transit. So this is our base year, 2015. So you can see there's some corridors where the SkyTrain, which is the rail transit in Vancouver, goes with lower intangible costs. And then as they make some planned upgrades to the existing infrastructure, becomes less inconvenient, more safe. And then here, this is 2030 to 2040. They're planning on extending the line out west to UBC. And then finally, 2040 to 2050, they add in another line south of the city. So you can see slowly over time, we would expect the intangible costs to be going down. So for each of those time periods, we incorporate those intangible costs back into SIMS, and that's when we run those policy scenarios. So we did a total of 6, but to spare everyone, and so we're not here for 5 years, I'm just going to go through a couple to give you an idea of what sort of output you can expect. So this is the big one, the emissions graphs. So I have 2 scenarios here that I'm showing. So on the left is the renewable city strategy scenario. So that's including policies that were articulated in the strategy. And then the 100% renewable energy scenario is something that we sort of designed to try and meet the target. So it's sort of meeting those targets by design. And then that dotted line in each one is the current policy pathway if nothing was changed, sort of the business as usual. So you can see in both cases emissions are going down, but in the renewable city strategy they're nowhere near 80%, which is the target. So we found that we had to put in some very aggressive policies in the 100% renewable energy scenario to get to that 80% reduction in emissions. So lots of standards and regulations where compliance is mandatory, lots of government investment. Things like voluntary information programs weren't really getting us all the way there. Subsidies as well, not playing a huge role in the scenario. And the second set of results I'll go over have to do with fuel use, which is important if you have a 100% renewable energy objective. So again, here, the same 2 scenarios with the dotted line. The purple, blue, and dark green are liquid biofuels, electricity, and renewable natural gas. And then the light green is natural gas, then diesel fuel, and then gasoline in turquoise. So the total amount shown is the total energy used, and then you can see how that's breaking down by each fuel. And again, you can see renewable city strategy, not aggressive to get to 100% renewable. And then again, by design, the 100% renewable scenario gets there. But an interesting finding here is that you can see the total energy use is a bit lower in both scenarios, but not as low as you might think. So there's still quite a lot of energy being consumed. Even when we go 100% renewable, it's just mostly coming from electricity. So our big finding here was that policies focusing on fuel switching are really important, which is sort of self-evident if you have a 100% renewable standard. So, anything that's going to force people to switch away from natural gas and gasoline, basically. And we found that energy efficiency policy played a supporting role to that. So we still have some efficiency policies in there, but to get there, you really need the fuel switching ones. Okay, so I'm going to zoom out a bit and talk about how these specific results were achieved in a more general sense. So what is the role of a tool in this case study, so that those of you who aren't working in Vancouver, which is everyone but me, can think about how that might be useful for you. So the use of a tool demonstrated the type of policies that we need. So again, that was getting at the standards and regulations as well as government investment. Things where compliance is mandatory is really what we need to achieve those very ambitious targets. We also demonstrated the level of stringency required, so they have to be very aggressive, very creative, really kind of pushing the boundaries. We also saw the outcomes we needed. So again, that would be the fuel switching, really important to achieve those deep emission reductions. And lastly, and I didn't talk about this as much during the results, but we did find that policy intervention by other levels of government was helpful in getting those emissions down and helping Vancouver achieve its goal, but not necessary. So in that aggressive policy scenario, Vancouver was able to basically achieve 100% renewable energy use without relying on more aggressive policies from the provincial or federal government. Okay, so last slide, just a few conclusions thinking about how we could apply this sort of tool or method to other communities. So some of the challenges representing policies for urban form, as I'd mentioned, sometimes municipal policies are really hard to capture in tools and in modeling. So we're trying to work on that by incorporating that spatial element, but it's definitely a challenge. And then, of course, as I'm sure everyone here has struggled with at one point or another, anytime you're working within a local context, adapting a tool or a method for that takes a lot of energy, takes a lot of work, and takes a lot of data. So, of course, that's always a challenge. And then some opportunities. So we see this, again, as I mentioned earlier, as a form of truth testing for local governments. So if you have a goal and you're serious about reaching it, this is a great way to try and test out some policies to see, if what you're doing is really going to get you where you want to go. There is also a potential to learn from other communities about what works and what doesn't. So even though every place is unique, there are some findings that are transferable from place to place. And lastly, and this has to do with sort of that last finding, use of this tool can give communities the agency to achieve targets in the absence of policy intervention by other levels of government. So especially with greenhouse gas emissions reductions, it can be really tempting to just rely on provincial or federal government to put in a carbon tax and help out. But by using a tool like this, you can see what you're able to do within your power to try and achieve those objectives. Okay, and that's it.
We'll just take a couple sort of clarifying questions, not sort of deep discussion. And if you could just repeat the question so that people that are on the phone can hear.
Okay, yeah. Yep.
Question, how are you dealing with non-spatial policies within SIMS? Like how do you simulate the impact of standards and codes and things like that?
So if we have, so the question was, how do we simulate policies that are not spatial in SIMS, like a standard or a code? So essentially there are some parameters in the model that will, if you are assuming compliance is basically 100%, you can just put that standard in the model. So for example, exactly, yeah. And you can even go so far as to, if you have something like a ZEV mandate, a zero emission vehicle mandate that's setting a market share, you can even just set it at that to see what the outcome is. But of course, the less intervention, the better. But for a standard or something like that, we would just put it in as, all right, all buildings have to be this efficient by this year because that's the policy. Yeah.
So the SIMS tool, is it like a big fancy spreadsheet? Is it proprietary software that you have to spend money on? Like, what is the actual tool? And is this something that a municipal practitioner could just pick up? Or is this something that's hours or days of training? Like, what is the actual thing?
Yeah, good question. So the question was, what does SIMS actually look like, and what's, I guess, the learning curve for learning how to use it? So SIMS has its own interface, but then it does use Excel for its results output. So you get some output sheets in Excel, and then you use the SIMS software. Although with 5 or 10 years ago, we started working on basically an Excel-based version for communities that was designed to be more off the shelf. And it was available for communities in BC, but we found it was challenging to maintain because the data in there is changing, and so there's a question as to who's maintaining it, since we are an academic group. So the short answer is it takes a long time to learn how to use, like a whole master's degree. So it would be hard to use in-house, but there has been some interest in recent years in making it more accessible for communities, and we've made some forays into that area, but it's not quite there yet.
Just a quick question. So some of the alternative scenarios that you propose for the City of Vancouver, were some of the outcomes of this project, did it turn into alternate policy suggestions that they are continuing to adopt? Or?
Yeah, so the question was, how are the results of this research being used for the City of Vancouver, or did they listen? And they did, yeah. We've given a few presentations, so the person who did this, the bulk of this research, Brett Zwelke, has given presentations to the City of Vancouver, and they are also working more extensively with SIMS to do some more work on this. So the short answer is yes, they listened to the results. I'm not sure how that's going to materialize into actual policy as of yet, but they are listening. And there are some emerged grads working at the City of Vancouver who know how to use SIMS, so that always helps. Yeah.
Morgan, you referred to technologies, and you mentioned EVs as one. Have you Is that the way things are defined? So, for example, you would define electric vehicles as one technology, but say other technologies like ride-hailing, autonomous vehicles, those would be separate technologies, or would you be looking at the way those two integrate and potentially mutually reinforce one another?
So we haven't included those specific technologies in the model yet. The key thing in the model has to do with the type of energy that those technologies are using. So we'd be interested not only like in looking at autonomous vehicles, but like what kind of fuel those autonomous vehicles are using. So as of yet, we haven't incorporated those into the model. It has come up as a sort of point of interest, but they're not in there yet, essentially because we don't have enough information. But if we were to incorporate them, then yeah, we would want to know what fuel those vehicles are using, would be the key question. Yeah.
Sometimes a goal like 100% renewable energy becomes the goal at any cost. Were you able to show in the model that on an individual basis, the cost after achieving 100% renewable energy target to them is lower, or is it higher than the business as usual case would have been once you actually implemented these policies and achieved adoption?
So the question was, does the model look at the cost of certain policy scenarios? In a sense, it does, in that there are costs in the model, technology costs, so you could do an analysis on that, but we haven't. So we haven't really looked at, okay, what would the overall cost to a city of pursuing this policy package? What would that be? It's not something we've done. You could probably move forward with that. You might need like a bit of supplemental information, but it's not something that just comes out of the model as an output for you to look at, no.
I think we're going to move on. So can we thank Morgan? So next up we have Michael Lee from Quest, who's going to be speaking about the cost-benefit analysis tool update.
Okay, good morning, everyone. So my name is Michael Lee. I'm the lead of analytics and services at Quest. And today I was hoping to give a bit of a brief overview of what we've very creatively self-called a tool, the cost-benefit analysis tool. So I'm hoping that I'll give a little bit of background as to where it came from, as Ian alluded to, what it is, what some of its potential uses are, and kind of where we're at in terms of thinking about next steps with the tool. Yeah. So as just a little bit of background on the tool, it was created, as Ian had mentioned, as part of the Integrated Energy Mapping for Ontario Communities IMOC project back in 2011 under the Canadian Urban Institute. And it was intended to model various energy reductions, greenhouse gas emissions reductions, and returns on investment of various buildings and transportation scenarios, as well as various renewable distributed energy resources. And for a while, and even still currently, as part of the Ontario Municipal Working Group at Quest, we've been kind of assessing what kind of the scope of what kind of an update might look like, and what the level of effort for that update would be. So what is the tool? I don't want you to really look too in detail at that, but it's just to show you that it's a spreadsheet tool. It's a huge spreadsheet tool. It's about 15 sheets or more for various inputs and calculations. And similarly, don't read that too much. There's various inputs. There's buildings, there's transportation, fuels, renewable energy tech, and land use planning data that all feed into this model. Some of which is municipally specific or community specific, and some of which are provincial or global inputs. So when this was originally developed at CUI, they used a bunch of consultants to develop the global assumptions and inputs. So in addition to some people at CUI, there was BA Group, Decision Economics Group, Intermodal Engineering, and CENIS. And then for the municipal specific inputs, there were 4 communities. There is London, Guelph, Barrie, and Hamilton. And using all of these inputs, the model outputs various things for mapping, which isn't really the part of the scope of what we're looking at, but it also then outputs things like different scenarios for buildings and transportation, as well as different economic outputs like returns on investment for the tech and scenarios. So this is kind of a reiteration of what I just said, but it all kind of feeds into different scenarios, financial analyses, and at the end of the day, it's a tool that's intended to help create different recommendations or strategies for policies and projects. So something that this might actually look like is City of London. We have Jamie here. And so what this tool outputted was something that's like it's a matrix that plots on the one axis greenhouse gas emissions reduction potential, and then on the other financial payback. And you can see in the top corner there's some things, and in the bottom corner there's other things. And so it really helps to give a lay of the land of what generally things you should be looking at when you're trying to achieve the greatest amount of greenhouse gas emissions reductions while maintaining a fairly good return on investment. And these are very community specific. So City of London has a lot of existing building stock. Population growth isn't terribly high. So yeah. So retrofitting existing buildings was at the very top. Whereas new LEED buildings, apartment buildings and condos was kind of at the bottom, but in a different municipality, it would obviously look very different. So that's kind of the big picture of what it can output, but more specifically, there's a couple sheets of outputs that delve into the individual specifics of what the one scenario, what does the return on investment look like? It breaks it down into individual things, which some communities might find helpful, as well as energy reduction and greenhouse gas emissions reductions potential. And this can aggregate into slightly more complex things like the marginal cost of something like greenhouse gas emissions reductions. So this was City of London, again, created this marginal cost graph. So that's where we're at kind of right now in terms of what it's been used for. But, this tool was developed, I guess 6 years ago now. So the assumptions are all really old. A lot of the assumptions are getting to almost 10 years old. So those are clearly the biggest thing that needs to be updated. And then some other things that we're kind of looking at into, technologies have changed pretty substantially in the last, 6 years or so. And adding new technologies and updating the existing ones is another priority. Updating the interface, I showed you the spreadsheets. Nobody really wants to get into that. So making it more user-friendly is another thing. And then, another thing that we've been possibly thinking about is because there are municipal inputs, working with municipalities would probably be key to making sure that it's a tool that ends up being able to be used by all municipalities potentially in Ontario. And I should mention that the aim would be for it to be kind of an open tool for people to use. So where we're at right now at Quest, we're still kind of engaging with different stakeholders, different consultants, just to see where things lay in terms of interest and scope, just to make sure that we're not overlapping with existing tools. We want it to be a complementary kind of tool and something that's useful. And then once we are able to, solidify that a little bit, we're looking for funding opportunities because this will be a fairly large undertaking. We did a bit of a level of effort assessment, and we will have to engage a lot of experts, consultant experts, to help develop the new assumptions. And then we can finally create a work plan and actually move forward in updating the tool. So that's all I had. Very shameless plug for Quest 2017 in Ottawa, November 6th to 8th. So hopefully you all know about it and are coming, but if not, please do come. That's all I had.
Again, if I could just ask you to repeat the questions for the benefit of those on the line.
Yep.
Just a quick question. Can this tool be easily adapted for both corporate and community purposes?
That's a good question. So the question was if it can be adapted for both corporate and community applications. I think it could be, but right now the way that it's built, it doesn't incorporate that. It kind of is in more aggregated, high level. But Brent Gilmore, Executive Director at Quest, who used to work at CUI, he might be able to provide a little more insight.
So ready to go up for a quick sec?
Sure.
For those who are curious about the tool, I'll get up to the mic. Yes, it can, but it wasn't designed to, simply from the interface. So the information of the corporate itself is in the model. All you have to do is just pull it out and actually create it. Correct. So you have to think of this model that was designed. It took 2 and some odd years and everybody's involvement to figure out what you're trying to do. The other part, I just want to build on what Michael was saying. It was modeled with the help, and each time at community, it started with Guelph and Rob, who was foundational in making sure we started in this process, and it ended up with Jamie benefiting from all the learnings from the first 3 communities before that. So in all fairness, it was a progressive development. But the outcome of that was what Michael's pointing at, the factors that would need to be updated, they have radically changed. And why it was useful for a lot of local governments in the decision-making process, it removed a really critical question for them, which was, what's their contribution to the goals of the province of Ontario? And that was one of the foundational questions that people were asking, because they didn't understand how to orient their plan locally to what a provincial priority was aiming for. And that is not where we started that project on, but it became the foundational need. And what was really helpful for a lot of people was saying, to get to our goal, we would need the province to green the grid to X percent, or we're never going to get there. And so what the model showed for a lot of people was that 50 to 60% of their goal, whatever it was, on average, was being made through greening of the grid before it even touched the boundary of that local government, which made it a lot more practical for people to start pricing out what options could they start to do. And even then, it still was significant. And the part that helped councillors, for an example, was when you put cost in front of them, their eyes started to roll over when they started to see the magnitude of the investment that would be required to achieve those goals. But they didn't stop. They said, well, what can we do of that? And so it was a decision support tool, not the decision tool. Just to be clear about the benefit of where these are used, it's helpful, but it's not your silver bullet answer. So I thought I'd just pull that back about where we learned and why the grid has completely changed. So all the assumptions behind it would need to be updated. So I think that's why it's useful, but it's also still applicable. The one thing that doesn't change is the actual economic analysis, the way you do it. Our return on investment is still return on investment. The inputs need to change. The IRR still need to change. How you go about that is still very relevant. But the opportunity now is that it's even more applicable. When we started, there was only a few communities who had plans. Now that there's so many of you who have plans, it's a nice way to come back and do kind of a financial analysis of your plan and say, what does it take to actually move forward, to actually implement, and where do you start deriving federal funding that's coming out now, gas tax dollars relative to provincial, and how do you move that forward? Again, none of that existed 10 years ago. So that's where the model would need to kind of combine where revenue sources are going, also in time, with what you can do locally. So it's a nice way to mirror the two, but it would be province-wide applicable. And that's what the model was designed for. You'd have to orient some of those factors, again, to make sure Southern Ontario is different from Northern Ontario, so you need to update a few things. So there's a background for you, but it's still useful.
How easy would it be to incorporate relatively new kind of policy considerations into this, like, for example, the degree to which a given technology would facilitate community or climate adaptation resilience. So I noticed that on the 3x3 grid, solar PV was on the left-hand side, second row up. It was demonstrating that there was some greenhouse gas abatement, relatively low attractiveness economically. I would think that has changed now, that there's probably almost no greenhouse gas. Well, there would be some, because you're at the marginal emissions factor for the grid when you're putting solar on there, because that's when the peaker plants are running. But I would think the payback is increased, but also there is a resilience benefit by generating electricity locally instead of being dependent on extended supply lines, if you will, that are vulnerable to extreme weather.
Sure. So I think the question was about how easy it is to build something like adaptation as a potential measure into the tool. My impression would be it would add another layer to the whole tool, because it wasn't really developed with that in mind. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Maybe doors for additional funding, though, or open some more avenues for the business case for adaptation. Because we all know we can't just mitigate anymore. We have to adapt, and there's a lot of benefit in tying the two together.
Yeah. So it's definitely something that we could consider when we're looking to update it, because, as you say, adaptation is kind of it's at the forefront of a lot of people's minds now.
So just to build on, and we'll come to the next question. Yes, you need another layer. I can hear John Sidley, who is the economist who spent 5 years kind of thinking about all these things. Adaptation in the program, you'd have to start saying, is it a CapEx in terms of an investment, or an operational saving? And how do you want to decide to show that? And that's where the back and forth discussions would need to take place. So yes, the model could be expanded to include that thinking of that layer. Would you want it to make a decision for you on a policy example of where it best fits in a 3x3 grid? Part of that analysis always came down to saying, how do we evaluate what's important? Is the reduction of future costs more important, or is it the operational savings today that would be more important? And then you have to weight some of that and then decide where you decide to put that, because it will filter all the way through in all your decision making. And then you also have to take into something that this model does not take into account, which is cap and trade.
Actually, I just want to build on that observation you just made. You talk about where's the cost, because in solar PV behind the meter, just to build on the question, the cost actually accrues typically to, let's say, a homeowner, and the benefit accrues to the grid by reducing the peaking plants or investments in substations or new infrastructure. Those investments in the grid are shared by everybody, but the cost of solar PV is typically borne primarily by the homeowners and the subsidies that get. How do you, that has a big role in terms of policy decisions, which we've talked about before. How do you reflect that in your model, CPA?
Want me to go into that a little bit, just for your benefit?
Sure.
So to repeat, I'll let Michael repeat the question, then I'll kind of go on it.
Sure. So the question was about how the model builds in things like the distribution of benefit and cost, given that certain tech or scenarios, the cost is to one party and then the benefit is to a different party potentially.
So in this situation, this is where engineering was always fun, because they just kind of looked at it as black and white, right? They weren't looking from the policy implication for the consumer per se. It was who's getting the saving, who's getting the benefit, and how do you allocate that would need to be a refined part of this model conversation then, to be quite frank about where you decide to put who earns the money back, right? In this case, if the cost savings in a city could add up to you're saving $300 million a year, well, who's actually saving that? It's not the local government, it's a global model, so it's the entire community. So how do you reallocate those savings back across the community? So yes, you could pull out the part for the corporation, but then is it back to the province of Ontario? Jamie wants to weigh in, I'm sure, and others. But that was part of the limitation, Jamie, that we had too a little bit. So go ahead. Excuse me.
Sure, thanks. So in our case, to answer your question, we assume that, especially when you look at this, that it's, once again, it's not the city spending this money. It's the homeowners, it's the local industry, it's the local commercial building owners. So, and then what we just did is we then kind of looked at it sort of globally. So the reason why, for example, new LEED apartment condo buildings are kind of in the bottom left corner in our case is that we kind of looked at it globally. We looked at our 1% per year growth, and we would say, yeah, sure, for those individuals who are building apartment and condo buildings, once again, they are spending the money up front, and then somehow they're getting that money back from the energy savings. I then look at it from the big picture side of it. But for the most part, there was, all we just said is within London as a bucket, there's a bunch of money being spent to fix old houses, and then in return, there's a bunch of money going back into those old houses that have been fixed. So that's how we kind of used the numbers that the spreadsheet had used, because once again, our use of this is we're trying to encourage the community and our stakeholders to take the action. So I don't know if that answers the question or not. So.
Are there any more questions? I can't see.
Nope, I don't think so.
Thanks. All right. I think we're good to move on. Let's give another round of applause.
I got to say, I really enjoyed that Q&A by committee. If anybody wants to join me and help answer some questions, that'd be fantastic. So my name is Kirby Calvert. As Ian was saying, I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Guelph. One primary stream of my research program is the use of geographic information systems to provide decision support for various energy planning and community energy planning initiatives. I'm going to speak specifically today mostly about supply-side decision support. So I'm going to pick up briefly on a conversation that Morgan started when she started to talk about demand-side mapping and sim spatial, so we'll pick up on that. And then slightly different from the other talks, rather than a specific tool or a very specific model, I'm going to talk about ways that you could approach existing tools in-house, that is specifically ArcGIS, which is a tool that, to my knowledge, most, if not all, municipalities have available to them and are currently using. And energy planners currently at least have a sense of what could be done if energy planners themselves don't know exactly how to use the software. The presentation will show you how you could use those existing tools in-house to more creatively to do some supply-side mapping and answer some questions that you might have. That's not to say that these couldn't be wrapped up into proprietary tools or standalone tools, but a lot can be done with ArcGIS if you have it available to you. So the presentation is going to touch on two primary themes. I'm just going to set the context and talk a little bit about the value add of mapping, why we would want to do it, and the kinds of mapping services and systems that are available to you as energy planners and municipalities and community members. And then I'll talk a little bit about best practices in local energy resource mapping. Now, some of this, I'll try to highlight questions that are relevant to an Ontario audience because, of course, municipalities in Ontario can't decide where exactly a wind turbine or a solar panel or something like that goes. But nonetheless, you all have questions about where they might go and questions about how you might best be positioned to facilitate them, even if it's just responding to provincial targets. So let's get into it and talk a little bit about the context and the ways that these are used. So, of course, they're used in analysis and decision support, and for a long time, GIS, geographic information systems, were used in asset management, particularly among utilities. It's only recently that we've started to use GIS for planning, and that's, of course, what I'm going to focus on now. So things like, for example, quantifying resource potential or identifying hotspots of energy demand and consumption. And increasingly, particularly as you get tools that are more refined, have stronger data behind them, you could use them for service provision. So in other words, informing targeted infrastructure development. So focusing on the use of GIS to actually help implement your plan rather than just develop the plan. But again, I'm going to focus mostly on that planning piece and happy to talk a little bit about the other two ways. Now, the other way it's useful that I found personally, I think others have found, and we're going to learn actually this afternoon, is for communication and outreach. So I've always said as a geographer, of course, I'm biased, but if a picture that says 1,000 words, a map tends to say 1,000,000 words. People just sort of respond to maps. They respond to context. It's a useful platform from which to focus conversations at the community level. So even if one does not see the decision support capacity of a GIS, I think the community and community outreach value and capability of GIS is inarguable. So when we think about the kinds of maps and mapping services available to us, I think about it in these terms. So we could do demand-side mapping, supply-side mapping, energy distribution mapping, or integrated mapping. So when I use the term integrated mapping, I mean a mapping system that could combine maps and spatial information of demand with maps and spatial information of supply, and incorporating some power flow into that ideally. I mean, that's sort of the ideal holy grail of energy planning mapping systems. We're not quite there yet. But I just wanted to make that point because I realize that integrated mapping is sometimes used in a very different context. And this is, from my perspective, just a brief overview of the kinds of mapping tools that are already available to you. So IMOC, of course, had a mapping component, the City Insight model, and SIMS, as we just learned, has a spatial component. MyHeat, you're seeing there at the nexus of supply-side mapping and demand-side mapping. They use thermal imagery to get a sense of where energy efficiency might be best targeted, but you could very easily also use that thermal imagery to think about, or some of the tools and platforms that they're using to think about PV or solar thermal. On the supply side, you've got BIMAT, the biomass mapping and analysis tool. I put RETScreen there at the edges. It's not exactly a mapping tool, but it's got spatial data. But again, it can usually only used to assess one specific project, not necessarily a landscape scale. The R4 and the Renewables for Nature tool, WWF, is building this to try to understand how they can inform siting decisions that don't compromise habitat and biodiversity. On the distribution side of things, we've got heat and power flow models. Now, these are usually proprietary models used by utilities. Utilities in the U.S. have some really great models, and they've got the capability to do some of this integrated mapping piece. They just don't yet. Most of the utilities down south just don't yet do it. And I should say that some of what I'm going to talk about is inspired by the time I spent in 2 years down at Penn State. But I'm now, of course, at the University of Guelph back home where things are more comfortable for me. So that's sort of the landscape. And what I want to talk about, I'm going to focus, sort of step back very quickly on the supply side mapping. I see some people taking photos. I can share these slides, by the way, if anybody wants them. We'll talk a little bit about best practices in local energy resource mapping. I've got students who are working on various aspects of this project, so some of these results that you're going to see are works in progress, proofs of concept of 3 primary streams. One is standardized approaches to renewable energy resource classification. 2, participatory GIS. So again, that's that decision support combined with community engagement. And 3, the rooftop PV mapping systems, which I suspect is probably most intriguing actually to this audience. But let's start with the standardized approach. So this is being led by Phil Terry, who's an MA student. And this work is currently ongoing in Nova Scotia and Kings County. Nova Scotia, a lot of this work is a little more relevant to the folks in Nova Scotia because the municipalities there have some control over some of their land use plans as they relate to renewable energy systems. The inspiration here is that the oil and gas sector has done a very good job for decades applying a rigorous and standardized approach to mapping and assessing its resource base. And they can communicate the conditions under which their next coal seam, their next oil patch might open up if market changes in one way or another, if policy changes in one way or another. We are borrowing that logic to help us better map and understand renewable energy potential in a given area. Of course, it needs to be done very differently because renewable energy systems are localized, they're land intensive, they interface with the land use system very differently than fossil fuels. But nonetheless, this logic applies, thinking about distinguishing the theoretical resource, everything we have available to us, from the actual reserve, that sort of realizable potential that we might ultimately be able to liberate under different technology, market, policy conditions. And so for us, it looks like an inverted triangle. So you would start with the theoretical resource potential, these theoretical resource maps. We do have these available for many of the renewable energy technologies. We can think about wind, solar, biomass to some extent in particular. And so these are measured and modeled energy potentials, and this is what it looks like in Kings County. We're showing wind speed at 80-meter hub height. And this map in and of itself from a planning perspective is necessary, but by itself insufficient. You can't really do much with that. That gives you a sense of where the potential resource might be concentrated, but of course there are many other factors that you would need to consider when trying to understand where renewable energy might be developed in within your jurisdiction. And so we would layer into that engineering constraints as well as technology constraints. So there aren't many in Kings County, so I don't have a map to show you here. But you could imagine things like slope or wetlands that cannot be built on. You would strip that out of the model, and you would reduce the quantity of the resource available to you depending on the efficiency of the technology that you're applying. So this map here, shows in some places it's on average annually about 8.8 meters per second. But you're of course not going to be able to recover all of that, even if it is blowing at 8.8 meters per second. And some technologies cut in at a lower wind speed, others cut in at a higher wind speed. So you can account for that in the tools that you develop. We would then layer into that some data that would signal to us where the resource might be developed economically. So these are what we're showing here are some of the data layers that you would feed into this conceptual model, into this cartographic model, in order to better understand where they might be economical. So proximity to transmission stations, of course, proximity to roads, land use and land cover type, these all have different costs associated with them. If you're further away or closer, of course, a different cost. If you're building on land that needs to be improved versus land that doesn't necessarily need to be improved, capital costs are lower, right? So we can reflect that and combine them into a map of economic suitability. So once you get to this point in the modeling process, you can start to answer questions like at what locations are new renewable energy developments likely to be economically feasible by layering on. So what we're showing here is just Kings County represented in terms of economic suitability, but those we're currently working to turn those numbers, those relative values, into absolute values. So we know, roughly speaking, back of envelope, how much it costs to build on, say, farmland that is relatively well drained versus farmland that's not well drained, or wetland versus rock, and so on and so forth. And so we can convert this suitability score into something that's more back of the envelope, giving you a sense of capital expenditures. We know how much it costs to install a kilometer of transmission wire, for example, right? So we could incorporate that information into the approach. And of course, we know that many economical reserves are not actually recovered for various reasons. One of them being regulations, local regulations in particular. Land use regulations. And so we would layer into the model a set of regulatory constraints. And I'm showing just one here, and that is setback distances for wind turbines. So currently, the regulation in Kings County is a 700-meter setback. You can start to understand, as one example, what your proposed or anticipated land use policies might do to resource availability within your jurisdiction, simply by rerunning the same data layer using a different regulatory constraint. So what if we extended the setback distances to 1,400 meters, 2,100 meters? You can get a sense of how much land is then cut out of that, and that would give you a much better sense of total resource potential under different policy constraints. And then you smash it all together, and this is what you get. You get a map of suitability. So again, this is just suitability scores, proof of concept. We're working on refining this and adding a bit more teeth, but you get a sense once you layer all of this stuff, you can start to ask and answer questions at what locations are new renewable energy developments likely to emerge or be proposed in my area. So that's in the case where you don't have control over where they go, but it might be helpful to know where they're likely to be proposed if you want to anticipate land use impacts, if you want to anticipate community concerns. Is there sufficient suitable land to support our local renewable energy targets? So we set these quite ambitious targets. Only a subsection of that is going to come from rooftops ultimately, and even if solar roads come here, they're not tomorrow's technology necessarily. So we're going to need to sprawl our energy system beyond city limits, and so we can get a sense of how far would we need to sprawl in order to capture sufficient renewable energy resources to do the 100% renewable energy strategies that Morgan talked about earlier. So that most of that was for wind. I just wanted to show what we can do for solar as well, and this is actually in Eastern Ontario, or not solar, excuse me, biomass, what we've done in Eastern Ontario. So this shows you the concentration of biomass resources, agriculture, forest, and combined agriculture and forest resources. We can also develop supply cost curves for given communities, so in this case, Smiths Falls, Bancroft, and Cornwall. We can get a better sense of what it's going to cost to bring biomass resources into the community to do whatever you're hoping to do with it. Burn it for electricity, hopefully not. Maybe doing something more creative with it. And this would account for all of the regulatory constraints, all of the sustainability constraints. This isn't all the biomass in a given area. It's the biomass that
we understand to be recoverable based on some of those economic and sustainability constraints that I just went over. So where we're going with this is incorporating some technology change, right? So different technologies are going to interface with the land use system differently, of course. So taller turbines mean that those setback distances we might want to increase those setback distances, for example, right? Or they might be ineligible for some locations that a smaller turbine might have been eligible for, or they cut in at different speeds, wind speeds, right? So in other words, the technologies interface with all of these different parameters in very different ways, and so you can reflect that by changing those parameters to reflect the technology that you're interested in. That's where we're going with it. That's where Phil's going to be going with it in the summer in particular. Now, Rebecca is actually building on some of this and using some of these tools for participatory GIS. So she's working in the Annapolis Valley region more generally, including Kings County over in Nova Scotia. So the idea here is that, and we've experienced this in Ontario, there's significant social opposition to some of these developments, and that's common of any resource development. So we're just trying to reflect that in the mapping tool. So what Rebecca's doing is a version of what we're calling community-informed spatial planning for renewable energy development. So the idea here is to talk to various stakeholder groups within a community and basically put a survey and a map in front of them. So this is a little bit different, but in some ways very similar to the charrettes that you're going to be doing this afternoon. We call this map-elicited interviews. So fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on how you want to look at it, this research is not necessarily tied to any specific sponsor or funding. We've got free rein to sort of experiment with some of these techniques. This is kind of an experimental technique, this map-elicited interview process. So she asked questions like, please fill out areas on the map which you would consider to be entirely unacceptable for wind farms. Then you could ask questions about, well, what would be acceptable? What would be conditional, right? Using these questions and the maps themselves as entry points into conversations about social attitudes toward renewable energy, and in this case, wind. So working with those community members, she was out in Nova Scotia a couple of weeks ago, literally drawing some of what would be acceptable, unacceptable, talking about why, unpacking the assumptions that go into those decisions. And you can see that there's green, so green means go, effectively. Red means they would not want them there at all. And gray would mean that, well, depends. If I own it, or if it's community owned, or if it's a small system rather than a big system, maybe I would accept this. So you can see that, very different responses. Some more nuanced than others, some more favorable than others, and some people who just want it wherever it can fit, as this map is showing here. Yes?
Just a question on the mapping. So if the initial work is an input to this, the map showing the highest opportunity for renewable, the 4 number in that track, don't correlate with any of the green areas on this map. So
yep.
Did she just ignores the scores and the suitability from the first study, does the surveys and then plots them out, and then you match them up later, or you skip surveying areas where there's no opportunity for wind and solar to start with?
That's a very good question. So actually what we decided to do was not use, so that prior mapping that I discussed, what we'll call the technical mapping, we didn't use that as input into conversations. We didn't want to bias anybody, quite frankly. We wanted them to just blank slate just based on landscape values, based on where you would and would not want to see these systems. Tell us. And then what we're actually going to do is the opposite. So you can take these individual maps, you can aggregate them by the farming community versus the urban community versus the recreational community in the different stakeholder groups, or you could just compile one single map, take all of these maps and run a compilation method that compiles them all into one map, and then overlay that onto the regulated reserves. So now you have a sense of not only where renewables can be developed based on regulatory market conditions, but where your community thinks they should be developed. And there's and it's actually a great entry point in a conversation when you show, well, there's really no wind speed to speak of in that region. Kings County's it's got enough wind. They're doing all right for wind, but solar, biomass, you might get into some of those conversations. So again, experimental, but it's a good point. I mean, we talked about that for hours. How much information do we give the user without biasing them and with just wanting to enter into a conversation? So maybe that's something we can discuss offline or later. So with that, I'll get into some of the PV, rooftop PV mapping systems. There's currently no lead for this. This work began during my time at Penn State. As I'll show the case study of the city of Philadelphia, Later, we started to work with the city of Louisville. When I came to Canada, it's very difficult to get working relationships flowing across the border, so some of it has stalled, and we're thinking about picking it back up with study students and other sorts of things. So I'll show you where we're at now. This is what, I should have actually showed this at the beginning. This is what a cartographic model looks like in a GIS, right? You've got data inputs going into different tools that yield outputs that then go into another tool. So just as Michael said, don't worry about what's going on underneath the hood here. It's just to show you that what we're ultimately trying to do with this particular project and with all the projects is to develop a conceptual model that we can put in front of you. So hopefully all you got to do is input the data. The GIS division within your municipalities could plug around with some of the parameters and you get an output that might be useful. More than happy to have students paid to do it, but we could also maybe figure out a way that this could fit right into your existing mapping systems and other decision support systems like City Insight or SIMS or whatever you're using. So basically what it does is this particular model takes LiDAR data. These are point clouds, meaning each data point has an X, a Y, and a Z, lat, long, and height. That's what it looks like when you classify them, so that's downtown Philadelphia. It identifies from all of that noise the rooftops in your region. It turns them into polygons. So those polygons we could then we use to represent not only building footprints, but also different rooftop segments. So you'll notice there that we're not representing a single building. We're representing, say, the east slope and the west slope as separate entities. And we can, once we've got it clipped, then we can continue to work with the LiDAR data and pull out information about tilt or slope, azimuth or aspect, area, shading, all sorts of things. That's what it looks like. So it does reasonably well as far as segregating some of those segments. And here's the database behind it. So you can see, sorry, what do you got there? Shading, aspect, slope, parcel ID, so we can associate it with a particular building type. Polygon area, right? All sorts of things that are important in terms of understanding where PV might be located. And so if you run this at the city scale, what you can do if you've got LiDAR data especially, is ask and answer questions like how much solar PV can we realistically expect to see installed in our city? Is it sufficient to meet demands? Which neighborhoods are most attractive, right? You can start to ask and answer those kinds of questions. So this is the entire city of Philadelphia map. Don't worry about the classes, but some rooftops are better than others for different kinds of technologies. Is basically what the mapping system can show you. Now that we can do better than that. We can also start to ask how will rooftop PV impact power flows in my service area. So this is an important question for utilities. And one of the big challenges and one of the big opportunities for GIS is that it can bring stakeholder groups together. So you can use these maps, the basis for dialogue between the municipality, the utility, the homeowner, the PV developers who are knocking on doors trying to get people to sign up, and they're just knocking on everybody's door and hoping that one or two of the contracts will come through. I know this because my brother is part of this right now. This sort of random prospecting approaches. So what we've done here, we've started to incorporate the geographic model that I just showed you, pull out those attributes, and bring them into the system advisor model, which is a techno-economic model. It models the technical and economic performance of different technologies produced by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. You could, in theory, incorporate it into RET screen. We've chosen NREL's tool for various reasons. Using that, you can get a sense of what your duck curve looks like under different development scenarios. So the duck curve is effectively the negative load as you get increased PV supply that utility is going to need to think about. Right? So as more PV comes on, they've got to start to shut down systems midday, and then they got to turn them on at night. So in theory, again, you can't tell a specific homeowner to develop or not to develop, but you can just get a sense of what if this neighborhood develops more than that neighborhood? What's that going to look like for my power flows? Well, how am I going to need to ramp up? So here we're just showing what if everybody developed on their east-facing slope? What if everybody developed on their south-facing slope? Just a sort of simple show and tell, so to speak, but you can get much more. Well, we're trying to get to a point where you can get much more detailed with this. So that's all I had. Thank you so much. Alex.
I've got 3 questions for you. So back to on the solar, do you have the ability to take into consideration, for example, homeowner preferences? So generally, solar is not popular on the portions of the roof that are facing the street, or at least current solar technology isn't.
Yeah.
So do you have the ability to kind of measure that kind of preference and then to look at the implications of technology innovation like building applied PV or building integrated PV,
Yeah.
like the Tesla solar roof?
Yeah, so we could do the preference piece in one of two ways. So you could model it yourself. So you as the analyst could say, you know what, most people don't like their rooftop to be covered with PV panels, or they don't, at least don't like it to be visible. So you could pull out of that data set I just showed you, the whole city of Philadelphia, what rooftops are facing a street. You could pull those out and say, okay, we're not going to build on those, or we're only going to build on 20% of those, or 50% of those, whatever the case might be. So you can model it. You can also do the bottom-up approach in the way that Rebecca is doing. So you can go talk to homeowners about their preferences, do the surveys that SIMS does, that the Emergy group does, or Merge group does before running their models to get a better sense of what that might look like. As far as technological innovation, you could certainly represent that in increased area and efficiency per rooftop. You could, again, run some sort of soft scenarios to reflect consumer preferences. So in other words, it's easy to represent how technological innovation will influence potential installed capacity. The social preference piece is a little more difficult, but again, you can say, assuming that we get PV shingles, that means more of these rooftops are going to open up, or we don't have to worry about any of those rooftop segments that are facing the street. We can open them back up. You can just start to play around with numbers, but it's very difficult to translate, as a lot of the modelers will tell you, a social preference into a specific number that is representative of real life conditions.
I have another question, but I'll let somebody else go up.
Okay.
We've been hearing about some of the utilities undertaking achievable potential studies, and so I'm wondering what the difference is between the suitability analysis approach, mainly that spatial, versus the achievable potential approach that some of the utilities are taking.
Yeah, they're very similar.
Repeat the question.
Oh, yes, sorry. So the question is about some of the achievable potential studies that utilities are doing and how that would compare to a suitability analysis that we're running here. Those would all be based first on a suitability analysis, the achievable potential, and they would be likely tightly coupled or more directly coupled to technical and economic models in the way that I was describing at the very end there. So when you want to get a better sense of achievable potential, it's nittier and grittier. In order to, you have to look at specific projects, specific locations, feed those data into a technical and economic model to get a sense of how proximity to transmission lines, all these sorts of things, affect probably using levelized cost of energy, how that compares to market rates. So I guess the short answer is that this would be the starting point, the necessary starting point, and you would just go in much more detail on the economic component of this, feeding the spatial information into a technical and economic model. That would give you a much better sense of achievable potential. And we use realizable potential, achievable potential. It's all sort of the same thing, right? What we're trying to do is get away from the traditional approach, which was to map the solar resource across space and to show this really big bubble. Like, we've got more solar energy than the world uses in decades and decades and decades, and say, well, what's the actual realizable potential? That's kind of where we're all going with it in subtly different ways, all starting with some of the suitability approach that I showed you here. And our motivation is to make sure it's standardized. So when one utility does an achievable approach, we would hope that the utility next to it would use the very same approach, that they can talk to each other, so that what they're calling achievable is what they're calling achievable. We don't yet have that standardized framework for the renewable energy sector. The oil and gas sector have had it for a long time. I don't know who was first. Let's go here.
I'm really interested in this, like the way you've done the mapping and layered all layers, but I'm wondering if there's a faster, simpler way to, like, have you thought about which are the most important ones in ruling areas out, or, and I guess it depends on what values we're going to put on, community acceptability versus actual places where there's enough wind or enough sun or enough rooftop or whatever. Has there been any, I'm thinking about, trying to explain it to council, making it as simple as possible, and is there a way to say, here's the three things that, are most important in saying where we can put solar, where we can put wind, and So these are the ones that we will look at in our
Yeah.
policy. Like these are policy variables. Well, then, because we can't deal with 17 policy variables really easily.
Yeah.
We can probably do with 3.
Yeah, yeah, it's a great question. We've within our team have had a number of conversations about where on that inverted triangle I showed you start. I mean, do you really need to start with the resource data? A lot of developers don't even start with the resource data. Right? They go look at, well, what land is available. Right? All of this is land based, so they're asking themselves what land is zoned, what land is relatively close to transmission wires. So if I were representing a city, I would want to know that last piece that I showed in the inverted triangle, the regulated reserves. So if we restrict all active farmland from development, if that's something that we're even capable of doing or we want to think about doing, if we want to increase setback distances, how much land area does that take away? You can just start there and get a much better sense. And then you can leave the other details to the GIS division or to other analysts within the team or to us or a team similar to that. But I would start, if I were a municipality, I'd be starting with that variable. You probably wouldn't want to start with the resource data because it's not really important to you. That's for the developer to decide ultimately. Yep.
So Kirby, with your LiDAR-based approach, especially using the solar PV one as an example, does the LiDAR basically take into account, or does it look at the shading from trees, and do you do it in July when leaf cover is at its maximum?
Yeah, that's a good question. The question is about does the analysis we have run and the LiDAR data itself account for shading, and when is the best time to collect LiDAR data if you want to account for shading? So to the first question, yes, we account for shading. So what the model will do is first identify building footprints. So it will reduce all the noise. But then when it gets to the shading analysis, it brings all that noise back in, right? And so what it will do is tell you if a given pixel, so after you take those points and then you turn it into a continuous surface or raster. So in other words, it's a set of grid cells that each have a value associated with them. And that value would represent height and slope and aspect. And you can use ArcGIS has a tool that allows you to model shading on each pixel based on where the sun is and the values of surrounding pixels. So you can use ArcGIS to do the shading piece, use the geometry in ArcGIS to do the shading piece, but you would want to use another tool like SAM, the NREL tool, to do what that means for the solar resource potential, because ArcGIS doesn't really do solar resource potential.
But does it see the trees?
It sees the trees, yeah. So a tree would be included in that. So if a tree was above, and the model that, so if I actually go back to here, so that shading has a value of 1. So in this particular polygon that I've pulled up, it suggests that 100% of the surface area is completely unshaded. It's exposed to the solar resource during solar sun hours. You would see, if I pulled up a different pixel, you might see 0.5, 0.45, and that's one way that you can account for some of that stuff. And this can run on an hourly basis. You can run it on a seasonal basis. It all depends on how detailed you want to get. Again, for a municipal planner, you might not need to know the exact solar potential on that specific rooftop. You'd want to get a general sense of suitability, which is what this kind of shows. Yes, question there, and we'll come back to Alex.
Does the model track thermal heat or thermal energies as well? So looking at developing a district-based geo exchange type system, can you pull in information from aquifers, from sewer heat recovery, waste heat from hockey arenas, industry, different things like that?
That's a good question. So none of the tools that we use and none of the approaches that we use touch on that. However, there are tools available to you if you're interested in that. So you can map that in one of two ways. One, with point data. So you can identify all of those sources of waste heat, or those centralized, relatively large-scale sources of waste heat and biogas and these sorts of things, and represent them and go do an analysis at each point, at each location. Or you can talk to the folks at MyHeat. They run thermal imagery over a city and can identify hotspots where there is more thermal energy than not. And they use this primarily to inform, at least this, to my understanding, primarily to inform energy efficiency strategies to target energy efficiency programs. So you can show very rapidly, you just got to fly a plane, get the thermal imagery. They've got an algorithm that will tell you where heat loss is greatest within the infrastructure of your city, but I'm sure that they could do it for aquifers and for other natural ecosystems as well. Yeah, so it's much more on, it would be much more on the demand side piece. Alex, and then we'll go to Marcus, if that's okay.
Okay.
We don't have time?
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Okay.
I think that would be the last one.
Okay.
This might be a bit of a mind bender, but the very best resources are the ones that will be probably exploited first. And they will be exploited using the worst possible technologies because over time the technology will improve.
Yeah.
So an example might be, well, so you have a microfit program, people put up maximum 10 kilowatts on the roof, but they might have more roof space than that.
Mm-hmm.
Then over time you shift to net metering, but if it's single entity net metering, then again, you're not going to use the entire roof space because you're only going to use enough to offset the consumption of one building. So I'm just wondering if there's a way to delve into that and just understand the implications of both technological advancement and the attractiveness of resources at the early days versus the sophistication of the technology, and also to get into what is a little, it's analogous to oil reserves where there's a portion that's unrecoverable because they haven't bothered to invest in appropriate like brine injection, sorts of things that can increase yields.
Yeah.
Same sort of thing with solar PV and using a great roof, but only covering part of it because that's all the policy will let you do.
Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, can you account for that sort of policy-technology interaction that ultimately reduce and limit the recoverable and economical reserve? So in an economic vacuum, absolutely the best resources would be developed first. But of course we know that these don't operate in an economic vacuum. What you actually saw was, given that in Ontario the feed and tariff rates were so high, suboptimal siting decisions. And it depends how you're classifying optimal. What is an optimal siting decision? Well, it depends on perspective, which is kind of the point of what we're showing here. But some of the ways in which we've tried to assess that and account for it in the model is by looking at actual siting decisions and actual development decisions. And we analyzed 100 of the ground mount photovoltaic systems in the province of Ontario and found, not surprisingly, that the packing factor, in other words, the area of land that they're using to actually cover with solar panels relative to the area of land that they've leased, is relatively low because they're going at 10 megawatt chunks. They're not trying to necessarily fill the entire area. They're just going after what the policy is incentivizing them to do. So they're looking for that sweet spot. So they won't cover the entire area. But then it's not very easy to just adapt the system and add some more rows of panels. It can be, depending on landscape type, but it isn't always. And the other bit is that when the prices are relatively high and you've got a lot of area, you're not incentivized to use the most efficient panel. You'll just use the panel that gets you the economic rate of return, right? So these are the kinds of things you're talking about. How do you account for that? So it becomes, we've assessed it empirically, and the question is, repeating the question to you, how do you account for that in the modeling process? You can shave off some of the resource depending on your interpretation of what you think the development response is going to be to an existing policy framework. So you can say, well, okay, there's 100 megawatts available within these 40 hectares, or whatever the case might be, but we're going to actually represent it as maybe 80 because we know that people aren't going after the maximum capacity factor and they're not installing the best solar panels. But then the response would change depending on the technology and the resource, but that's in general how you do it, empirical to the modeling approach. Marcus?
Just to add quickly to that question about waste heat, the City Insight model actually does have the structure to account for that because we're modeling all the other industrial and commercial activity and making assumptions about use versus waste heat and bringing that possibly into thermal spatial networks. So there's that, but I just wanted to say this especially the solar rooftop analysis is really fascinating. We do a bit of that already at City Insight in a somewhat more simplistic GIS feed-in way, but maybe we can talk offline about it.
Yeah, the data are, I was fortunate down in Penn State to have access to really high-quality LiDAR data. I've since learned in the last week that we have relatively high-quality LiDAR data in the Greater Toronto area. I didn't know that until last week and got quite excited, which is why this is one of the reasons why this is going to be revived. But you're right, it can be done back of envelope relatively easily, but to do this, you need really good data. So yeah, we'll chat about how how to incorporate these. And that's the integrated mapping piece that I'm talking about. Supply side, really good supply side mapping combined with really good demand side mapping. Other people do demand side mapping way better than our team does, and we're not going to reinvent the wheel there. We'd much rather partner. Can we talk offline? Is that okay?
Well, I mean, we're going to have some time. I was thinking of having like 15 minutes for maybe some, bringing Morgan and Michael up, maybe if there are any questions around sort of the interaction between the tools or, how they might kind of co-evolve together or be integrated. So there's a little bit more time for discussion if you guys want to come up. If there is any, so you're chomping at the bit, for folks to come up. We're going to have lunch, I think lunch is there, so if you're grumbling, fear not. Alex, go ahead.
So my question's for Morgan. I was really fascinated by your progressive mapping of Vancouver as different transit scenarios were implemented. Just so I understand what that was representing, so if I get it right, you'd take a particular pixel on a map and you'd say, well, if you lived here, what would be the cost of taking transit? Or what would be the cost of your various different alternatives? And if you lived over here instead, what would it be? And then you'd basically measure on that basis so that over time, as the proximity of an available transit resource got better, that would translate into a cooler map as a whole. Is that accurate?
Yes, that is pretty much it. Thank you. And then in addition to just the cost, we would also include what we call the intangible cost. So we're taking into account any changes to the cost of transit, but those aren't terribly significant. So we're factoring in like the convenience. If there's a new station near you, maybe all of a sudden you would take the train when you could before, and so on and so forth. But more or less, as you explained it, that's it. And we're just trying to capture changes to the quality of service and convenience and all that as well.
So if you wanted to, say, model the impact of something like the Zoom bus rapid transit system where you have intersection priority for transit vehicles, and would you have the ability to basically measure the economic value of that investment?
Measuring the economic value would be a little trickier. The algorithm that we have set up is basically to calculate the intangible cost. So if you just wanted to look at financial costs or economic costs, it'd be a bit of a different question. So it could be done, but you have to calculate it a different way than what we're doing now.
So there's a question for Morgan as well, building upon Alex's, but when you're looking at the active transportation infrastructure, I think one of your examples showed that. Does your model, do you make assumptions or do you build in sort of the differences between, let's say, a painted bike lane versus a segregated bike lane versus, let's say, the pathway through the park, and do those have different intangibles as to, overcoming people's fears around cycling? Is that kind of, you build your model to make different levels of the attractiveness for those options?
Yes, so we do that by putting a quality index. So like a separated bike path would have higher quality for cycling than just like a cycling route or somewhere where you could cycle, but it's designated for that.
Could you also do that with pedestrian infrastructure? Because we know, for example, walking down a sidewalk in the suburbs is not very rewarding versus sort of a main street commercial district. So is that also built into the model?
Yeah, that's in there as well, and we also include walk destinations, so that has to do with the land use. So suburb isn't going to be attractive for walking because there isn't as much to walk to, versus downtown is going to be more attractive because you can go walk to your groceries or pharmacy, whatever. So we do have that incorporated as well.
Oh, okay.
I guess in terms of walking or active transport, walking the dog.
Yeah.
Suburbs are very convenient. You want to walk the dog around in circles.
Yeah.
But not necessarily where you need to go.
Yeah.
Perfect choices.
Rob, do you have a question?
Yeah, thanks to all the panelists for your presentations. So this is for any of you. In your work, you've had your head in modeling for a long time. Have you had a view to, if I describe it properly, the next layer of conversation around the impact on local economies? One of the things that I've experienced and I observed is an effort to get accurate about costs and benefits. gets you kind of stuck because the costs are usually quite large, and the who pays question comes up, and the conversation can really split. And it could converge back again when you talk about investment as opposed to cost and its impact on local economies. So if any of you had a view to tools around local economic impact or measuring local economies or similar analysis?
I mean, I don't want to put down the project, Jamie, but I mean, you have a little tool that you kind of developed by yourself that kind of looks at that. I don't know if you.
I think, or you were just referring to the, just like how much, like the $1 billion tool?
Yeah, so the one that kind of takes the different commodities and then how the costs filter out in terms of where the spending actually ends up.
Yeah, so I mean, we've done it, once again, at that macro city scale, where we basically say, you know, we use so many million kilowatt hours of electricity, which is so many hundreds of millions of dollars, and roughly trying to figure out what's London Hydro's cut, what's Hydro One's cut, what's OPG's cut, what's the federal government's cut. Same thing with gas stations and gasoline and the like. So we've done it at that scale. I know also the COI model that was developed for the IMOC project did look at things like, for example, you know, the estimates on the jobs potential, you know, that usual, you know, one job for every X million, right? So that was built into that COI model. Once again, it's always, I always say they're order of magnitude things, but at least it gives you something to talk about. And I know, as I mentioned before, when we talked about the COI model, you know, when you're talking about retrofitting older houses, we're assuming that that is the, you know, if you spend, you know, to improve the house, the way the model worked is to take an old house, to get the efficiency to be 25% better, it would roughly cost X amount of dollars, but in return you would get Y amount on a per year basis, you know, per unit floor area. Who's paying for that? The model that was developed for us didn't care per se. It just says to get that house 25% better, it costs X per square meter floor area for the benefit of Y per floor area. The assumption is the building owner's paying for that, but once again, where the policy side comes into play is, can you sweeten the pot somewhat to once they get people over that perceived barrier for, you know, why aren't we fixing our old houses, right? So that's where the incentive programs that the province or the utilities do are an attempt to kind of nudge people off that hump to take action. But what our model looks at, especially in the lending context, is on a big picture, where are we going to get the biggest amount of GHG reductions and gigajoule reductions? We have a lot of old buildings, so therefore for us, that's where the model of COI said, for London, it's fixing old stuff. For Caledon, it's going to be high performance new things. And that's really what the tool will look at is it kind of gives you a relative feel as to, you know, given what you got, where do you want to focus your community's efforts, not just the city's efforts, but your utilities efforts, your community groups, your citizens. What do you want them to focus on? So in our case, we encourage people to fix up their old houses. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, I think to build off of some of that, the regional economic benefits piece is one criteria against other criteria you might evaluate a given policy. So you would think about, you'd have to represent regional economic development in some way. So whether it was local or GDP or employment opportunities, whatever was being represented. And I would actually put that question back to municipalities and say, how would you prefer regional economic development to be represented? One of these indicators or multiple indicators? And then think about the tool and the extent to which it's able to inform it. We've talked about other indicators, greenhouse gas, cost of greenhouse gas emissions, which isn't necessarily, you can tie that into regional economic development, but it isn't giving you specific regional economic development. I have had many conversations with some colleagues who do regional economic equilibrium modeling. And the assumption that they make is that when you, let's say, choose solar, you're, of course, taking jobs and employment away from something else. So you've got a limited market for electricity. And so if you're increasing the market share of solar, you're decreasing the market share of something else, and those balance out. From a provincial level, you'd want to know how they balance out, and if you're interested in economic development, you'd want to know which jobs per greenhouse gas abatement or jobs per dollar, which scenario gave you a better score on those indicators. If you're, say, Guelph or London, you might not be worried about what you're doing in the coal sector because the people who live in your city don't work already coal plants, right? And so there's two things there. One, it becomes very political very quickly at different scales of analysis, and so modelers have a difficult time weighing in on those particular conversations, knowing that we're so looking at each other. And that's one of the reasons why we try to get question-driven models rather than model-driven questions. That's part of the inspiration for this whole session. And I think that there's the other piece is that it's very easy to fudge with numbers from a modeling perspective on this particular question to show greater or lesser economic development depending on the assumptions they're making about equilibrium, about where the jobs are coming from and where they're going and all sorts of things. So it's a very difficult thing to model and provide an indicator for as a basis for conversation. So bringing back to, I think, Brent's general point, which is part of the theme of this, these are decision support tools. Basis of conversation, not necessarily a conversation. Yeah.
Chris,
it doesn't really answer the question, but it's, I guess,
Christine, did you have a question?
I'm getting a little bit away from the municipal level here, but I just wondered, I'm not even sure how to frame the question. The province has been looking in their LTAP at the mix of renewables versus other kinds of power, and I wondered, based on your Kings County mapping, type of mapping, has the province done any analysis similarly of, like if you say you want to get rid of nuclear, as they have in some jurisdictions, do we even have enough suitable places for other kinds of energy to be developed to replace nuclear? I mean, even considering that conservation would be, take away part of the demand probably.
The province is moving in this direction in various ways. So the short answer is no, they haven't done that analysis.
So we don't know.
I can tell you that we definitely have sufficient land base. The question is how we want to allocate that land. So we have more than enough land, more than enough resource. The question is what, again, speaking of equilibrium, but there's going to be trade-offs, and we need to have conversations to what those trade-offs are going to be. How much of it do we want to come in-house? How much of it do we want developed in Ontario versus coming from Hydro-Quebec? Those are conversations, political conversations that could drive some of the model. We could do that analysis. Now, in my opinion, the analyses that have been done at the provincial level, are suited to the old model of energy planning, right? Where the province did this, and I think we're shifting slowly to a more localized approach to energy planning, and that's why our modeling approach is shifting to a more localized approach. Even before policy, we recognize that it's not really relevant for municipalities just yet. We think it's coming. And so you can, very detailed, get a sense of if you wanted to allocate some of your land in your municipality, within your municipal limits, within your regional limits to renewable energy, where would it come from? What trade-offs would you expect? And is it sufficient to cover off your demands? So some of those questions are starting to be asked through the integrated regional resource planning process that the ISO is initiating. I see the sense of the looks, maybe not in your region, but in some regions, those questions are being asked, but still not with these modeling tools. So we actually have a proposal with the ISO to run these cartographic models at the regional scale, at a scale at which decisions are actually made.
You're in a pretty unique situation there in
2 nuclear plants,
housing Pickering and Darlington.
Oxford County. Is anybody here from Oxford County?
I don't think so, no.
Ironically, my daughter works for Oxford.
Also, she can tell you that they haven't even really done this analysis.
No.
They don't know exactly where the resource is going to come from. I think it's, they're setting a target, right? It's just going to see what comes of it. It's fantastic. Our analysis could inform them and say, you might not get it all within county boundaries. You certainly, of course, can't dictate that. You can't tell them about first thing. If you did, it might be more costly. You might want to think about importing some of this. Our analysis could help them with those kinds of questions.
And if Ontario ever puts the offshore in the Great Lakes back in the mix, I mean, I would think that that would be a huge.
So that's the point that we haven't done. We just got to talk about trade-offs. And so to get back to the regional economies, jobs is a big component of it.
Yeah.
It's energy has been in the political discussion, a modeling discussion, but the reality, this informs the modeling that energy has been a job creation strategy for the longest time. It's the reason we have coal plants, we don't necessarily need coal plants. It's the reason why coal plants has just been shifted to biomass. We really need that electricity. We need those jobs. Communities need those jobs. So this all informs, this is why we're very careful about asserting these analyses. We want the political conversation to sort of inform how we're monitoring.
I see 1, 2, 3, 4 hands. Can we keep them short-ish? I don't know about you guys. I'm starting to get a bit hungry, but we do have some more time. So yes, maybe we'll start there and go.
Very short question. It would seem like the integration of those three types of models to be able to support planners making decisions is needed. Is there a meta model that people are working on for specific questions? Because if you have a particular target, you know about your resource, and you've done a cost-benefit analysis, you might turn around as a planner and say, well, shoot, I can just go and ask a whole bunch of these farmers in a nearby area to see if they're open to doing this, and then I can advertise the availability of a solar resource for a developer. I've taken away a bunch of their work. I could even apply for funding to be able to add a interconnection to the grid. Like, there's a bunch of stuff that you could do to make it dead easy for someone to invest the infrastructure if these three models were integrated. Otherwise, somebody has to do a whole lot of work over and over again. Is there anything doing that?
So I've been involved in conversations, the Combined Energy Options Ontario project that Lucia was leading, it's sort of falling at the wayside. I remain in conversations with Madeline McPherson, who's an electricity power flow system and can understand, can use the spatial data that we would produce, fit it into the power flow model. You would then need to link an economic model of the cost benefits of the power flows and get a sense of the financial picture. And so it's something we've talked about. I think at the time being, so you might agree with this, or maybe have other opportunities that we can explore, but at the time being, it's much more of a soft linked approach. So we'll do the spatial analysis piece, we'll package up data in a way that another modeler needs it, feed it to them, they'll run their model with the data we provide, and so on. So that tight coupling of the models to be able to click a button here in the spatial piece and have it totally reflected back in the front end where the user is actually interpreting the data is labor intensive, resource intensive. So conversations have started. We know conceptually what we need to do, but that's good.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. I know for the type of modeling that we do, like since we often call it hybrid model, that it's combining aspects of different types of energy economy models already, but there are limits to what you can combine in one method or one model. So for instance, the local economic development impacts is something that since isn't really designed to do, that would be something more like a macroeconomic model to do. And so combining those two methods together, there's only so much that they can be integrated before you're more soft linking, like Herb said, which is kind of the way we have the spatial extension set up right now. It's soft linked to SIMS rather than totally integrated. So yeah, I think it's a question of how complicated you're willing to make your model, if you want a monster model, or if it's easier to just keep things separate and then soft link them when that's helpful.
I would just quickly add on to that. I fully agree. Yeah, it's complicated because there are tools that are more broad in scope that don't require as much input at the forefront, and it serves a different purpose than a very complicated detailed tool. And to try to put them into one, it becomes a very complicated detailed tool that doesn't serve the purpose of something like a broader tool that is more of a scoping kind of tool. So while I think in theory, like a one master model would be pretty amazing, I'm just not entirely sure about how feasible it is, but
it can be done, and because it's difficult, there's no reason to not do it. But I think it's just
depends on what questions you want to answer, I guess, and how often you're going to ask the question.
We're quickly running out of time, but do you Did you have a quick question?
Yeah.
Nabila?
Nabila, yeah. Thanks, Kirby, Morgan, Michael. Really enjoyed your presentations. It sounds like all of the projects started off commissioned by a particular municipal client, and presumably you had a direct liaison person who could, push it through council perhaps, or through a decision-making process. Just wondering, for scaling up these efforts provincially, maybe nationally, maybe globally, who is the decision maker that you want to talk to? Who is the decision maker? Is it somebody based in government? Somebody from the homeowner side of the civil society? Who do we need to talk to get these projects actually implemented?
Well, I would say for us, we've actually moved kind of reverse, where Sims and Emerge has done a lot of work at the provincial or federal level over the years, so we're kind of moving down to work at the municipal level. And so Mark Jackson, that head of the research group, has worked with people working with the BC commercial government quite a lot over the years. And now he has some contacts with the city of Vancouver, and he's sort of able to participate in the development of the renewable city strategy itself. So we kind of actually went like from the top down, so it was sort of opposite for Sims in particular.
Mark?
Yeah, some observations sort of pick up a couple of issues here as we were sort of chatting. That there were some specific conversations. I mean, there's a set of distributional questions. The modeling sort of helps with, but not. There were certain things that we're struggling with how to take into account in some of the modeling. The adaptation and resilience conversation, for example, that was very interesting. Because where do you put that into this discussion? Because in a community energy planning context, that's a large piece of the value proposition. We know that in terms of what's worked with councils and what hasn't. And that kind of led me to start thinking, well, part of this is that we kind of need to separate the modeling conversation from the decision framework conversation. The modeling gives us some outputs, but then we still need another framework to evaluate what those outputs actually mean and what the nature of the trade-offs that are embedded in the different choices. Because these sort of tell you, well, if you go this way, you get this. If you go that way, you get something else. But then we needed some other frame to think about, well, then what are the choices were they going to make? What are the trade-offs going to be? What are the criteria that we need, which resilience and adaptive capacity could well be very central ones, to sort of complete the process to get you into a decision phase as opposed to an input phase.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a good observation. I think that's where your work meets the models.
That's where my work meets Kirby's, and we've been having conversations with Madeline as well about the same sorts of questions about, well, as you run those things, the trade-offs start, or you need to be conscious that you're creating trade-offs, and have a structure for identifying them, and then a structure for thinking through how are you going to deal with them in your decision process.
The good news is the climate modelers have worked out a lot of this before us, quite frankly. The climate modeling used to make the same mistake, right? They tell you temperatures can increase, decrease so much, precipitation can increase, decrease so much. And then realized, well, wait, the average temperature doesn't matter for farming. Farming affairs go extremes. So then they started to model extremes. So they went from a climate first modeling approach to, they call it farmer first or community first. They thought, okay, what's important to the community? And then let's think about how we represent it. And so that's where we're trying to get, is learn lessons from climate models. Ask the questions first, and then think about how this.
Well, even there we need to be careful, because a lot of decarbonization modeling looks exclusively in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and doesn't take into account larger sustainability trade-offs that might be happening within different pathways.
I think there's one more hand. If we can keep it really short, that would be great.
Yeah, it's going to be a short, 2
With extensive commentary? Okay.
Renewable natural gas. Morgan, I wanted to know if it was a piece of the pie when you looked at this 2050, and if so, what kinds of policy did you see most effective to achieve your targets in the model? And then for Kirby, my question was, has any of the gas utilities approached you to look at the location of feedstock for anaerobic digestion? Do we understand any of those?
Yeah, so the renewable natural gas model is pretty interesting.
blending, is it they put it into the natural gas mix, and how much of that is going to Vancouver, so on and so forth. So what we ended up doing was sort of limiting how much renewable natural gas could get into the model, because otherwise it took out almost too significant of a chunk. And most of that was going into commercial buildings, for the most part. So most residential buildings were switching over to electricity, and then there's some renewable natural gas in freight transportation and in commercial buildings.
Were there any policies that you tested in the model to ramp up the uptake, or was it just assumed that the gas was going to be different?
Well, so what we would do is kind of put the policies in the model, and then the model tells us what technologies we think are going to appear as a result of those policies, and then each of those technologies demand a certain fuel. So that's kind of the shakedown. So yes, there were some policies that we put in there that had to do with commercially space heating and cooling for commercial buildings, the requirements for that. And then we found that in the model, the types of technologies that were winning for that were demanding renewable natural gas over, say, electricity.
And so the short answer is no, I haven't been directly approached by any utility to map out biomass for biomassa potentially, although I know that some of the, there are approaches and tools available to do just that, sort of proof for head of cattle at the county level, and combining with the previous map I showed of plant-based biomass. You could aggregate those maps, so certainly the tools are available. Utilities have been in the room in conversations and expressed interest in some of the work that we've done, but haven't directly commissioned any of that. I think ultimately I can tell you that we don't have nearly enough biomass to supplement biomass. Even the 10% targets are probably too high relative to actual resource potential. But biomass can do a whole lot of other things for us to displace fossil fuels, for example. So they have higher value, lower volume applications. And the modeling we're going to show you that this is what you want, this is your actual potential. Maybe then you think about taking this potential and splitting this into lower volume, higher value context, like ethane production for plastics rather than ethane for ethylene rather than methane for.
We're going to break lunch. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, panelists. Thank you all for staying with us. We've got an exciting afternoon. Again, more interactive, hands-on energy design charrette. So I hope you're all able to stick around for that.